In 1929, Jesse Jones opened the Golf Building, Houston's tallest building. It opened officially in the summer of 1929. He opened his beautiful bank lobby for the National Bank of Commerce, and within a month, the stock market crashed.
That stock market crash marked the onset of the Great Depression and the gradual collapse of the nation's banking system.
Houston was mildly hit at the beginning because of oil, cotton, lumber, but even so, demand was shrinking, and the Depression had a leveling hand throughout the nation.
In 1920, there were probably 50,000 financial institutions in the United States, banks, credit unions, savings and loans, things like that. 1933, it's at 13,000 banks are left. The decline in the number of banks, it comes from thousands of bank failures, and those failures then lead to combinations and purchases and larger units moving in to take over the assets.
Houston's banks were not immune to financial woes.
Jones realized that there were two banks in Houston that were in deep, deep trouble. This was in October 1931. He realized that if these two banks closed, it would have a domino effect, not just in Houston, but across the region, and would even affect Louisiana and Arkansas, where small rural banks had kept deposits in these two larger city banks. So Mr. Jones gathered all the city's bankers and some of the business leaders into his office on the top floor of the Golf Building, said, "We have to do something about this. If we don't, it's going to be a disaster not only for Houston, but for the entire region."
Not all local bankers agreed with Jones.
R.M. Farrar, and I believe he was president of the Union Bank and Trust. And he was the one who said, if these banks are mismanaged, they should fail. In fact, he would criticize Mr. Jones. There are letters between the two of them. And R.M. Farrar said to Jones, "You need to cut your telephone wire, quit making all these calls, don't make yourself into be the Santa Claus, you're not, and we're all in trouble, we're all struggling, and we can't afford to do this kind of rescue." And of course, Mr. Jones felt just the opposite, and that's when he wrote to him. He says, "We cannot, we must be our brother's keeper," and that was his response to R.M. Farrar. From what I can gather, the meeting lasted 2 or 3 days and nights. That was contentious. People were slamming their fists on the table and demanding this and refusing to do that, and Mr. Jones just wouldn't back down. Eventually, had to call Captain James Baker, who was vacationing at the time in Massachusetts and owned one of the largest banks in Houston, and he called him like at 2 o'clock in the morning during one of these very contentious meetings and said, "I need your help, I need your support, to sway these people who are holding up this rescue effort for the Houston banks." And Captain James Baker indeed did do that and helped push the holdouts over to Mr. Jones's side, and that was one of the reasons why the rescue plan worked. In the end, Mr. Jones and his National Bank of Commerce took over one bank, and the Meyer family, the Joseph Meyer family's interests, took over another bank, the two banks. As a result of this action, no bank in Houston failed during the Great Depression. They all stayed open, except for the bank holiday, of course, but none of them failed, and we escaped a lot of the difficulties other cities suffered because of Mr. Jones's intervention in 1931.
Based partially on success in Houston, Jones was summoned to Washington to lend a hand in solving the nation's crisis.
Mr. Jones was appointed as a member of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation by Herbert Hoover in 1932. The year before, Herbert Hoover had said, "The economy is sound, there is no trouble." A year later, he was starting the Reconstruction Finance Corporation just to support banks, insurance companies, and railroads.
Democrat Jones ended up serving Republican Hoover thanks to the efforts of fellow Texan and House Speaker John Nance Garner.
There's many stories about how Garner made this recommendation, but the one that seems to be the most outstanding is that instead of a list, Garner gave Hoover a piece of paper with one name. And the one name was Jesse Jones. Hoover said to Garner, "I thought I'd asked you for a list." And Garner replied, "Here's my list." And the name was Jesse Jones.
As a member of the board, Jones got to work.
The RFC ended up loaning money literally to thousands, tens of thousands of American financial institutions, to banks, savings and loan associations, credit unions, businesses, government agencies like Fannie Mae was a creation of the RFC.
Though some progress was being made, other cities chose not to follow the example Jones had set in Houston.
Detroit is a perfect example of a city that did not create a pool of money to support their local banks. Mr. Jones went to Detroit and met with Henry Ford and said, if you can pool together enough money, you can save your city's banks. Otherwise, they'll collapse and close. Henry Ford refused. He said, you know, I'm young enough. If I lose everything, I can get it all back. I'll start all over again. I'm not doing this. And as a result of his lack of participation in this pooling of money to support the Detroit banks, they shut. They closed down. And that really began the domino effect, where by the time Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated, every bank in the United States was closed, including the New York Stock Exchange. And it basically started with those Detroit banks.
Jones became chairman of the RFC under Franklin Roosevelt and stayed in Washington through the end of World War II. Echoes of his work still resonate today.
So the RFC buys this stock in all these banks. Jones exercises voting rights. He sets salaries for these bankers. Okay? And if they'd had a failing bank and they needed government money, he'd cut their salary.
And he knew in the long run, yes, it would be expensive, yes, it would be a sacrifice, and yes, it would mean that we are interdependent and not just separate individuals doing what we can to maintain our own self-interests.
At the end of his life, Jones wrote his autobiography, and he entitled it $50 billion, okay? Because that's how much money, 1930s and 40s money went through his hands. It was an astonishing number. Not unlike the breathtaking trillion we're looking at right now. So it was a very similar situation where you have a massive intervention by the federal government in the economy.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week on Postcards from Texas.
Mailman bring a postcard yesterday. Mailman